Your smock is plain linen, tied loosely at the sides, and it falls to your knees without weight. You move to the table and touch the wood with your fingertips, finding it smooth and cool, the surface polished by countless sleeves and the gentle friction of paper. A small earthenware jug sits at the back of the table, beaded with moisture on the outside, and you lift it now with both hands, feeling the balance of the water inside. The water you pour into a shallow ceramic bowl makes a soft trickle that rises and then fades, replaced by the stillness that is the true sound of the room. You pour only enough to fill the bowl halfway, watching the surface settle into a flat, glassy disc that catches a sliver of window light. 2 brushes wait in a clay jar at the far corner of the table, their wooden handles worn to a darker brown where your fingers have held them before. You take each one out and hold it up to the light, sighting along the bristles to check that no hair has splayed or curled overnight. The first is a square brush of squirrel hair, flat-tipped and soft, meant for broad washes. The second is smaller and rounder, of sable, meant for detail. You draw the squirrel brush across the back of your hand once, gently, feeling the whisper of the tips, and then set it down on a clean scrap of linen. The pigments are arranged on the shelf above the table, in small, lidded pots of unglazed clay. You reach up and take them down one by one. The indigo pot is the heaviest, because indigo is dense and the color runs deep, even in powder. You lift the lid and see the fine dark blue heap inside, settled like silt. Next is the azurite, a lighter, brighter blue that comes from grinding stone, its grain slightly coarser and catching the light with tiny glints. Yellow ochre is the color of sun-warmed earth, and the verdigris pot holds crusty blue-green crystals that smell faintly metallic. You set the 4 pots in a neat row at the top of the table and close the larger storage chest that lives beneath the shelf, its iron hinges making the smallest of creaks. Now you turn to the shelf of roll charts. They are stored upright, each one a thick cylinder of parchment tied with a linen tape. You know them by the labels written in sepia ink on their outer edges: Costa do Brasil, Mar Oceano, Insulae Moluccae, and others still blank. You choose the one labeled Costa do Brasil and lift it down, cradling it in the crook of your arm because the roll is wider than both your hands. The parchment has a faint give when you carry it, a slight springiness, and you place it gently onto the slanted table. You untie the linen tape and unroll the chart with slow, steady pressure, smoothing the edges with your palms to keep it flat. The chart is large enough to cover most of the tabletop, and the corners you anchor with small leather-weighted pads that sit at the table's 4 corners for this exact purpose. What lies before you is a coast drawn in black iron gall ink, precise and already fully dry, made by a chart maker whose hand you never see. The land is a long, jagged shape along the left side of the parchment, cut with inlets and bays, dotted with tiny islands, the mouths of rivers marked by delicate parallel lines. The rest of the sheet, the vast space to the right and across the top, is empty ocean, nothing but the pale, warm color of the parchment itself, unmarked except for a few faint rum lines that extend from hidden compass roses somewhere off the edges. This is what you are here to color, this emptiness that will become the sea. You pick up the indigo pot again, and using a tiny horn spoon that hangs from a string on the shelf, you scoop out a few grains of the deep blue powder. You hold the spoon over the mixing dish, a clean white ceramic saucer, and tap it once with your finger so the grains fall in a concentrated little cone. Then you add the gum water. The gum water is kept in a small stoppered bottle. You pull the cork and tip the bottle just enough to let out 3 slow drops onto the indigo, watching the liquid bead and then soak into the powder, darkening it at once. With the blunt end of your brush handle you begin to stir in small circles, grinding the paste gently against the dish until it smooths out, losing its grittiness. You add 2 more drops of water from the bowl and keep stirring, the motion a steady, circular rub that you feel in your wrist. The mixture becomes a thin, milky blue, the color of early morning sky seen through a mist. You dip the tip of the squirrel brush into it, then pull the brush across a scrap of parchment left on the table for testing. The mark it leaves is even and translucent, not a paint but a true wash, so thin you can still see the parchment grain through it. The color is right. Now comes the long, quiet work. You pick up the square brush and dip it fully into the saucer, letting the bristles soak up the wash. You wipe the brush very lightly against the rim once on each side to remove any excess that might bead, and then you lean forward over the chart. The first stroke always goes to the north, at the very top of the empty ocean. You place the brush tip down just inside the margin line and pull it smoothly downward. A slow, even movement from your shoulder, not your wrist. The brush leaves behind a transparent ribbon of blue that glistens for a few seconds before the parchment begins to drink it in. You lift the brush at the bottom edge, just shy of an inked latitude line, and the stroke ends cleanly. Without pausing, you dip again, wipe, and place the next stroke beside the first, overlapping its edge by a single hair's breadth so that the two bands will dry as one continuous field. The second stroke moves just like the first, down and down, the bristles whispering over the tiny hills and valleys of the parchment surface. Each stroke is a breath, each dip a small pause. You work your way across the ocean, one band of blue after another, until a long rectangle of damp wash is glistening under the morning light. The sea is beginning to form, a pale sheet of color that softens the stark lines of the ink coast. You stop after a dozen strokes to let the first layer set. While you wait, the room holds you in its quiet. The window looks onto the courtyard, where a small potted bay tree stands in a terracotta pot, its leaves motionless. A sparrow lands on the rim of the pot, tilts its head, and flies away without a sound that reaches you. Inside, you notice the way the damp parchment has already started to curl slightly at the edges, lifting off the table by less than a finger's thickness. You rest a clean wooden ruler across the corner to hold it flat, and the parchment settles back with a tiny crisp sound. The blue of the wash has already lightened as it dries, becoming a ghost of the color it was when wet, a mere promise of ocean that will need many layers yet. You mix a second saucer of wash now, this time scooping a few grains of azurite along with the indigo to cool the tone, because the sea off Brazil is a deep, cool blue, not the warm indigo of home waters. You stir until the color reminds you of the sky over the Guadalquivir just before full dark. The brush is wiped clean on the linen rag before you dip it fresh, and then you begin the second band of the morning, lower on the chart, working from the horizon line that marks the equator toward the coast. The strokes are the same slow pull, the same lift, the same soft overlap, and you lose yourself in the rhythm so completely that the bell of the nearby church, when it eventually tolls, sounds as if from a great distance, a note that arrives and leaves without disturbing anything. By the time the sun has shifted its angle enough to send a bright oblong across the table, you have covered perhaps a third of the ocean with the first pale wash. You set the brush down and step back from the table, flexing your fingers. Your eyes move over the work, checking that no stroke has gone dry too quickly and left a hard edge, that the overlap of each band is invisible. This is what the morning has made, a sea that did not exist an hour ago, a quiet blue that will deepen over days. The smell of gum water and indigo hangs in the air, clean and mineral. You pour fresh water from the jug into your bowl, the old water faintly tinted and cool, and you begin to clean the brush, swirling it in the bowl until no trace of blue clouds the water, then laying it on the linen to dry. The chart stays where it is, anchored at its corners, its new sea gleaming faintly under the growing warmth of the Seville morning. The blue wash on the chart has dried to a pale, even film, and the ocean now holds the first faint suggestion of depth, as if the parchment itself has begun to remember the sea. You stand beside the table looking down at the work of the morning, and the room around you is so quiet that the settling of a single grain of pigment in the saucer would be audible if anyone were listening. The waiting has become a part of the air. No word has come from Magellan's fleet in so many months that the silence has ceased to be a question and has become simply a condition, like the cool of the stones or the smell of the gum water. The expedition departed San Lucar de Barrameda in the autumn of 1519, 5 ships with their sails bellied out toward the Canaries, and the last certain news that reached Seville told of the fleet having found the strait far to the south, a narrow, treacherous passage between dark cliffs where the water ran white with fury. That was more than a year ago, and since then the ocean has swallowed every word, every signal, every hope of a courier ship. The Casa de Contratación keeps its records in neat ledgers, and the entries for the Armada de Molucca remain open, the pages blank after the date of the final departure from the coast of Patagonia. You do not know what has become of the ships. No one in the city knows, not the merchants with their spice contracts, not the pilots with their charts, not the officials who stamp their seals on endless documents. The silence is complete, and in the workshop it is not felt as absence but as stillness, a slowing of time that makes each brush stroke its own small eternity. You return to the table and pick up the square brush of squirrel hair, its handle still faintly damp from the rinsing it received at the end of the morning's work. A fresh saucer of wash waits beside the indigo pot, mixed earlier and left to settle, its surface a perfectly flat disc of milky blue. You dip the brush into the liquid, watching the bristles drink it up and darken, then lift it out and wipe the tip once on each side against the clean rim of the saucer, a gesture so familiar that your hand does it without your attention. The chart is anchored at its corners by the small leather weights, and the unpainted portion of the sea stretches away to the right and downward, a pale field broken only by the ghostly lines of the rum network that cross and recross in faint ink. You place the brush at the top of the next uncolored strip, just where the dry blue ends, in a soft feathered edge, and you draw it southward in one long even motion, the bristles flexing slightly as they ride over the grain of the parchment. The wash flows from the brush in a transparent sheet, darker for a moment where it pools, then settling into a uniform tint as the paper drinks it in. You lift the brush at the latitude line that marks the Tropic of Capricorn and move your hand a tiny fraction to the right, dipping the brush again, wiping it again, and beginning a second stroke that overlaps the first by a margin no wider than a single hair. The sound the brush makes is the softest whisper you can imagine, a sound like dry grass stirring in a breath of wind, and it is the only sound in the room for the long minutes during which you work your way across the chart, one strip after another. Your shoulder moves in a steady rhythm. Your breathing slows until it matches the pace of the strokes, a tide of air that rises and falls without hurry. Between each band of blue you pause just long enough to let the damp edge begin to lose its shine, and you use these short intervals to observe the slow transformation of the sea. The underwater part of the parchment, where you have already laid the second layer, is deepening into a color that can no longer be called pale, a cool, watery blue that holds the memory of the indigo and the azurite together. The freshly painted strips glisten, and you watch the way the light from the window slides across the wet surface, making it look like the skin of a slow river. The tallow candle on the windowsill has burnt down by another finger's width, its flame steady and silent, and you mark the passage of the morning, not by any bell or clock, but by the shrinking pool of wax at the candle's base and the growing expanse of color on the chart. When you have laid down 6 more strips, the region of sea directly off the Great Bulge of Brazil is fully covered, and you stop to let the whole area dry. You lay the brush across the linen rag and rest your hands on the edge of the table, feeling the slight ache in your right shoulder that always comes after the first hour of work. The chart is now half ocean, half blank parchment, and the contrast pleases you in a quiet way that has no name. The damp place you have just painted begins to curl upward at its outer edge, lifting from the table in a soft arc as the water in the fibers evaporates unevenly. You reach for the clean wooden ruler and lay it across the curling corner, and the parchment settles back down with a tiny, crisp sound that is like the closing of a very small door. A moment later the curl tries to rise again at a new spot, and you place a second ruler there, and then a third, until the chart is flat and obedient once more. The floorboards of the workshop are old chestnut, dark with age, and when you shift your weight from one foot to the other, they answer with a low, woody creak that comes and goes in a single note. You hear that note now, and then the silence returns, filled only by the tiny, continuous sound of the drying paper. A faint rustle so close to the edge of hearing that you might be imagining it. Outside the window, beyond the courtyard, the street of the Cal de los Mercaderes begins its slow midday stir. A cart passes, its wooden wheels rumbling over the cobbles, the driver's voice calling something to a mule that does not answer. The sound enters the room muffled and distant, as if carried through deep water, and it does not disrupt the stillness so much as it underlines it, a reminder that the world outside continues while the workshop holds its separate, suspended time. You think, without any urgency, of the fleet. Somewhere beyond the vast disk of sea you are colouring, perhaps still sailing, or perhaps already at anchor in islands no European has ever seen. The ships of Magellan's expedition are carrying their crew through days of unknown weather and unknown stars. The silence that surrounds them is the same silence that surrounds you, a quiet that stretches from this small stone room all the way across the Atlantic, down the coast of the continent you are painting, through the strait, and out into the ocean that the chart still labels simply Mar del Sur, with no certain boundaries. It is a silence that holds no anxiety in it, because anxiety would require expectation, and expectation has long since been replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of work that asks for nothing but the next brushstroke. You go to the window and look out into the courtyard, where the bay tree in its terracotta pot stands in a patch of sunlight, its leaves motionless and dark. A small brown lizard clings to the warm stone of the wall, its throat pulsing quickly, and as you watch it, darts into a crack and is gone. You turn back to the table, and your eyes travel over the drying chart, the row of pigment pots, the saucer of wash that has now developed a slight skin on its surface where the gum is beginning to set. You break the skin with the tip of the brush and stir the liquid gently, and it remixes into a smooth, usable state before you dip once more. The afternoon unfolds in the same slow manner. You mix a new saucer of wash when the first runs low, measuring the indigo and the azurite in the same proportions, adding the gum water drop by drop, stirring until the color matches the sea you have already laid. The next section of the chart is the lower ocean, below the tropic line, where the sea stretches down toward the latitude of the Rio de la Plata, a region still unexplored and drawn with cautious, tentative lines. The strokes you make here are shorter because the landmass widens, and you follow the contour of the coast with a series of careful, curving sweeps that hug the inked shoreline without ever touching it. The brush moves down the estuary of the great river, leaving a transparent blue veil that washes right up to the dotted line marking the unknown interior. You think of the water of that river, muddy and warm and full of silt, pouring into the sea you are painting, but the thought is a quiet one, a flicker that passes through your mind as the brush passes over the parchment. The tallow candle has burnt down to a stump, and you replace it with a fresh one from the drawer, lighting the wick from the old flame before snuffing the old stub with the brass snuffer. The new flame steadies and then stretches upward, and the light shifts slightly, casting a warmer glow across the uncolored portion of the chart. You pause now and then to stretch your fingers, to roll your shoulders, to pour a cup of water from the earthenware jug and drink it slowly while looking at the half-finished map. The water is cool and tastes faintly of the clay it has rested in, and it clears your throat before you set the cup aside and return to the brush. By the time the light begins to angle lower through the window, the entire ocean off the Brazilian coast has received its second wash, and the blue has become a deep, tranquil field that makes the black ink of the coast stand out sharply. The sea is still not finished. It will need a third layer, perhaps a fourth, to achieve the full, rich saturation that the chart requires. But today's work is done. You lay the brush down and look at what you have made, and the silence in the room is the same silence that was there when you began, a quiet that holds the memory of the morning's first stroke and the afternoon's last, a quiet that contains the absent ships and the waiting sea. You clean the brush with slow care, swirling it in clean water until the liquid runs clear, then laying it flat on the linen rag. The saucer is emptied of its remaining wash with a tilt of the wrist, the thin blue liquid poured into the waste jar, and the saucer is wiped with a damp sponge. The pigment pots are checked and covered, the gum water bottles stoppered, the leather weights lifted from the corners of the chart so that the parchment can lie flat and undisturbed as it finishes drying. The tallow candle still burns, and its light trembles slightly when you pass your hand near the flame. A small and silent dance that you watch for a long moment before you pick up the brass snuffer and extinguish it with a soft, final puff of smoke that rises and dissolves into the dimming air. The workshop settles into the dusk, and the sea on the chart, still faintly damp, gleams once in the last of the light, then fades into the patient dark. The morning light comes again, unchanged, through the same tall window, and the workshop receives it with the stillness of a place that has not stirred in the night. You stand at the shelf of finished and unfinished charts, your hand resting on the rolled cylinder of the Brazilian coast that now carries 2 layers of blue across its sea. That chart will rest for another day while its color settles into the fibers, so you select a different roll, a smaller one labeled with the single word Verde. This is a practice sheet, a study of the shoreline between São Vicente and the Bahia, drawn not for any official folio but for the quiet calibration of color. You unroll it onto the table, anchor its corners with the same leather weights, and look for a long moment at the black ink coast that snakes across the parchment in a fine, unwavering line. The mapmaker's hand here was restrained, drawing only the outline of the land and leaving every interior detail empty. The work you are about to do will fill that emptiness with a soft, earthy green that speaks of forests no one in Seville has ever walked through. Turning to the shelf, you reach past the indigo and the azurite to a small brass mortar that sits beside the verdigris pot. The mortar is heavy for its size, the metal dark with patina, except where the pestle has worn it bright inside. You lift the lid from the verdigris pot and tilt it, letting a dozen small fragments tumble into the brass bowl, irregular chips, the color of corroded copper under a bright sky, bluish-green and crisp, with a faintly sharp smell like old metal left in rain. These fragments are the crust that forms when copper plates are suspended over vinegar and left to rest for weeks. A slow alchemy of vapor and metal that turns the bright pinkish ore into something else entirely, something that will become the color of new leaves. The vinegar that made this verdigris came from a wineskin long ago, and its journey from the barrel to the pigment pot was a quiet chain of hands. A vintner in Jerez who pressed the grapes, a merchant who shipped the wine to Seville, a craftsman who filled an earthenware jar with copper scraps and poured the vinegar over the blue-green bloom, then waited for the blue-green bloom to creep across the surface. That bloom was scraped off, dried, and packed into clay pots, one of which now rests beside your elbow, while these small fragments wait in the mortar. You take the pestle in your right hand, its smooth brass shaft fitting comfortably against your palm, and you begin to press and turn it against the verdigris chips with a gentle, circular motion. The sound is a soft grinding that rises and falls, a low, gritty noise that has no sharp edges and soon becomes another layer of the room's quiet. The chips crack under the pressure, first into smaller splinters, then into grains, and finally into a fine, soft powder that begins to climb the inner curve of the mortar. Every so often you stop, lift the pestle, and use a small bone spatula to scrape the powder back into the center before resuming the turn. The motion is slow, your wrist tracing a path you have followed thousands of times, and while you grind you feel the morning deepen by degrees, the light shifting from grey-white to pale gold across the table. When the verdigris has become a smooth, silky powder with no remaining gritty bits under your fingertip, you set the pestle aside and tip the mortar's contents onto a sheet of clean scrap parchment. The pile of powder is bright, almost startling, the color of a kingfisher's back, but you know that this brightness alone will not serve for the coastlines. Pure verdigris laid on a map would be too sharp, too cool, too much like the mineral it was. A forested shore needs warmth, a hint of yellow, the memory of sun on leaves. So you reach for the pot of yellow lake, a pigment made from the berries of buckthorn that were gathered by women in the hedgerows of Lombardy and boiled slowly until the color bled out into the water. That colored water was then thickened with alum and chalk, dried into cakes, and shipped in bales to Seville. The pot you hold contains a pale, dusty yellow that smells faintly of dried petals. You scoop a small amount onto the branch of your horn spoon and tap it onto the parchment beside the verdigris, then mix the two powders together with the tip of the bone spatula, folding the blue-green into the yellow until the pile becomes an even, warm olive that reminds you of the color of oak leaves in midsummer, muted and soft. Now the gum water must be added. You take the little stoppered bottle, its glass thick and cloudy with age, and pull the cork with a soft pop. One drop falls onto the olive powder, darkening it instantly to a wet brownish green that spreads outward in a slow round stain. You watch the drop sit for a moment, domed and glossy, before you begin to stir it in with the end of a brush handle, moving in tiny circles that incorporate the powder from the edges into the center. The paste that forms is thick at first, resisting the brush handle, so you add a second drop from the bottle and a few drops of clear water from the bowl. The stirring becomes easier, the paste loosening into a liquid that flows when you tilt the saucer. You dip the tip of a round sable brush into the mixture and stroke it onto the testing scrap. The color that dries there is not the bright verdigris nor the pale yellow, but a true map green. The color of a shoreline that is neither land nor sea, a threshold tint that will mark the edge of the known world. Satisfied, you clean the sable brush in the water bowl, then dip it fresh and hold it poised above the practice chart. The inked coast begins near the top left of the sheet, a cape that juts out in a smooth curve, and you place the very tip of the brush just inside the black line. The wash flows from the bristles in a thin, controlled bead that you draw along the contour of the cape, following every small indentation and every tiny point that the mapmaker's quill has made. Your hand moves in tiny arcs, slow and precise, the brush never touching the ink itself, but coming so close that the green seems to bloom right up to the boundary. At the tip of the cape you pause, lift the brush and re-dip, then continue along the next curve where the coast turns inward to form a small unnamed bay. The green you lay is thin, transparent, letting the parchment show through as a pale undertone that gives the color light. You are not filling the land with solid pigment, you are washing the edge only, leaving the interior blank and creamy, so that the eye of the pilot who will one day use this chart can travel from the dark blue sea to the dark incline and then to this soft suggestion of forest. The contrast is gentle, a quiet statement that the land here is wooded, that the coast is not bare rock but a green curtain hanging down to the water. At each estuary where a river mouth splits the shoreline into two lips, you let the green wash bleed just slightly into the sea, a faint diffusion that mimics the silt and the fresh water mixing with the salt. The bleeding is deliberate but delicate, achieved by touching the brush to the wet green and then drawing it ever so softly seaward for a single stroke before lifting. When you lift, the color flows back toward the shore and settles into a pale, indefinite haze that softens the hard edge of the ink. You move this way from estuary to estuary, cape to cape, re-dipping only when the brush begins to drag dryly across the parchment tooth. The small islands scattered along the coast receive their own patient attention. Each one is a closed shape of ink, no larger than your smallest fingernail, and you color only the outer rim, leaving the centers the color of the parchment. The brush tip describes a tiny orbit around each island, a miniature journey that lasts only a few seconds but requires the same steadiness of hand as the broadest sea wash. You hold your breath for these, not from tension, but from a natural slowing of your body as it matches the tiny scale of the work, and you release it only after the brush lifts and the island's green ring is complete, a faint halo of vegetation enclosing an interior that remains open, unknown. The morning continues, and the coastline gradually receives its green. Every cape, every bay, every river mouth and rocky promontory is traced with the same slow care, the same quiet re-dipping, the same patient arcs of the wrist. Nothing hurries, nothing pushes. The tallow candle on the windowsill has burned down by a small increment, and the sun outside has advanced across the courtyard until it touches the rim of the bay tree's pot with a bright line of warmth that the terracotta drinks in silently. The sparrow that sometimes visits has not returned. The street beyond is quiet in the midday hush. Inside the room, the only movement is the brush traveling along the coast. The only sound, the faint whisper of sable on parchment, and beneath that, the deeper silence of the waiting that never leaves. You come at last to a long, smooth stretch of shoreline where the coast runs nearly straight for the width of your hand. Here the green can be laid in longer sweeps, and your brush moves without lifting, drawing a ribbon of olive wash that follows the ink like a second, softer line. The color dries as you go, so by the time you reach the end of the straight run and the coast bends again, the beginning is already matte and stable, darker than when it was wet, but still translucent. You pause and look at the overall effect. The land is now gently enclosed by green, bordered, defined, while the sea remains blue on the other chart and pale on this one, waiting for its own color another day. The effect is that of a continent beginning to breathe. You clean the sable brush with the same ritual as always, swirling it in clean water until the bristles release every trace of green. The water turns a faint cloudy jade, and you pour it into the waste jar before refilling the bowl from the jug. The saucer that held the green wash is scraped with the bone spatula, the dried olive crust collected and set aside. The brass mortar is wiped with a dry cloth, its interior now bearing a slight greenish bloom that will remain until the next grinding. All the pigment pots are checked, lids pressed down firm, and the practice chart is lifted from the table and laid on the drying rack beside the larger chart of Brazil, the two of them resting side by side like quiet companions. Their colors, blue and green, face upward toward the ceiling beams, and in the filtered light of the afternoon, they seem to hold all the quiet of the morning you have spent. Your hands are stained lightly at the fingertips with a faint greenish residue that soapwort and water will later remove. You notice this as you stand by the table, flexing your fingers and feeling the gentle tiredness in your right hand from the many tiny arcs of the brush. Outside the window, the courtyard is at its brightest now, and a single line of ants crosses the flagstone in a steady, silent column, going about their work with the same unbroken rhythm that has carried you through the day. You watch them for a long, slow breath, then turn back to the workshop where the maps lie drying and the sea you have not yet painted still stretches wide and empty, patient, waiting for its next layer of blue. The first chart, the Brazilian coast with its 2 layers of blue sea and its thin green rim of shore, has been resting on the wooden drying rack for nearly an hour. You turn your head to glance at it and see that the surface has lost all shine and now holds only a soft, matte evenness. The parchment flat and stable under its own weight. The colors are settling into the fibers, the indigo binding with the gum, the verdigris locking onto the chalk-sized surface, and you know that by tomorrow morning it will be ready for a third wash or for its final touches of detail. For now it waits, and you turn your attention to the next roll on the shelf. This one is heavier, thicker, its linen tape tied in a double bow. The label written in sepia ink along its outer edge reads Atlantico Portolano, and beneath that in smaller script, Costa de Europa et Africa. You carry it to the table with both hands, the roll cradled against your smock, and lay it down gently before untying the tape and easing the chart open. The parchment is of a larger size than the first, broad enough to cover the whole slanted table with an overhang at the bottom that you let fall over the edge, its weight holding it steady without the leather corner pads. You smooth the sheet with your palms from the center outward, feeling the cool, dry surface that has been curled for some weeks and now resists slightly before relaxing. The inked lines that emerge are dense with information. Here is the familiar shape of Iberia, delicate and well-known, and beneath it the hump of Africa running down toward the Gulf of Guinea. The Mediterranean is a busy space, crowded with tiny place names and little hated coastlines. But your eye passes over all of that because the work today is not on the known waters. It is on the great Western Ocean, the Mar Oceano, the vast blank that stretches from the Pillars of Hercules all the way to the unfinished edge of the parchment, where the New World has been sketched in with tentative islands and a shadowy coast marked Terra Incognita. The afternoon has grown a little warmer. The heat of the day outside finds its way through the stone walls by slow degrees, and the air in the workshop, while still cool compared to the street, has lost the sharp freshness of the morning. You feel it as a slight softness on your forearms when you move. Nothing in the room stirs, but a single fly has entered through the gap in the shutter hinge and now crosses the table in a low, straight line, its shadow traveling over the parchment for a brief moment before it passes out of the light and vanishes into the dimmer part of the room. You watch it go without breaking your rhythm, and your hands continue their work of smoothing the chart and arranging the tools. The water in the bowl has grown tepid from the day's warmth, so you pour it into the waste jar and walk to the courtyard cistern to draw fresh water. The 30 steps across the flagstones are warm under your shoes. The sun now angled into the western half of the courtyard, and the bay tree casts a short, stubby shadow. You fill the earthenware jug at the cistern's spout, the water gurgling into the neck with a deep liquid note, and then you return to the workshop, the jug held in both hands, its surface cool where the fresh water presses against the clay. Inside, you pour the new water into the ceramic bowl, and the surface settles into a clear, colorless disc that reflects a small, wavering square of window light. The blue mixture you make this time is slightly different from the morning's. You take the indigo pot and the horn spoon, scooping out a deeper measure of the dark powder, enough to darken the sea by one more shade. To this, you add a few extra grains of crushed azurite, the lighter blue that cools the tone toward the color of deep ocean water rather than the softer coastal tint you used on the Brazilian chart. The powders mingle in the saucer, a small grey-blue heap, and you add the gum water drop by slow drop, stirring steadily with the brush handle until the paste becomes a liquid that swirls easily around the dish. 2 more drops of water from the bowl thin it further, and you test it on the same faithful scrap of parchment. The dried stroke is deeper, a true marine blue that will hold its own against the dark ink of the coastlines and the rum lines that cross the ocean in every direction. Satisfied, you set the saucer near the top right corner of the chart and turn to the waiting sea. The Port-o-Land chart is organized by rum lines, those fine straight rays that spring from compass roses drawn in careful circles at various points across the parchment. The roses themselves are inked in black and red, their points labeled with the initials of the winds, T for Tramontana, L for Levante, S for Sirocco, and so on. The lines they emit run in every direction, crossing and recrossing to form a delicate web that pilots use to lay their courses, and you must color the sea without smearing or obscuring a single one of these lines. The brush you select is the Squirrel Square, freshly cleaned and dry, its tip still holding the perfect flat edge you rely on for the long strokes. You dip it into the fresh blue wash and begin at the top left of the blank ocean, near the coast of Galicia, where the sea begins its westward sweep. The first stroke runs from north to south, a long unbroken pull that follows exactly the grain of the parchment, and the wash flows out behind it in a transparent ribbon that darkens a moment before settling. The rum line that crosses under this stroke remains visible through the blue, its black ink undimmed, because the wash is thin enough to act as a veil. You lift the brush at a latitude line that marks the parallel of the Canaries and move a hair's breadth to the right, dipping fresh and wiping the tip, then drawing a second stroke that overlaps the first with the same invisible precision. The 2 bands merge into a single field, and the ocean gains its first layer of color, a pale sapphire that will deepen with time. The afternoon sky outside has thinned to a high, pale haze, and the light through the window has lost its morning sharpness, becoming diffuse and golden. The fly returns for a moment, settling on the rim of the water bowl, its wings folding and unfolding once before it departs again toward the shutter. You pay it no attention beyond a brief flicker of notice, your concentration held entirely by the slow advance of the brush across the sea. Every day hift in strokes, you pause and wipe the bristles on the damp linen rag to clear the tiny build-up of pigment that gathers at the ferrule, a precaution that keeps the wash flowing evenly and prevents hard edges. The wiping itself is a small ritual, a gentle squeeze of the bristles between thumb and forefinger through the cloth, a redipping in clean water, a shake of the excess, and then back into the saucer for a fresh load. The rhythm of it blends into the larger rhythm of the work, a small cycle nested inside the longer one. The sea you are coloring stretches westward past the Azores, past the Madeiras, past the last known islands, and into the space where the chart maker's ink grows sparse and tentative. On the far left edge of the parchment, a faint shoreline has been drawn with a lighter hand. The coast of the New World as it was known before Magellan's departure, a scattering of capes and inlets that trail off into blank space. The ocean between that distant shore and the African coast is your task, and you move across it methodically, strip by strip, the brush describing the same long descent each time, the same gentle lift at the bottom margin. Your breathing has settled into a slow, deep pattern that matches the pace of your arm, and the slight ache in your shoulder has become a familiar warmth rather than a discomfort. The church bell of Santa Maria de la Alva, just across the rooftops, marks the hour with 2 low, unhurried notes that roll across the neighborhood and enter the workshop as a vibration in the air rather than a sound. You hear it without counting. The work does not need counting. The shadows in the room have lengthened noticeably now, the slant of the sunbeam having crept from the table edge across to the far wall, where it lights a patch of the whitewashed plaster to a warm cream. The tallow candle on the windowsill has guttered slightly, and you reach over to trim the wick with a small pair of snuff scissors, letting the burnt fragment fall onto the stone sill before the flame steadies and rises again. You turn back to the chart and see that the first band of wash, the one you laid at the very beginning of the afternoon, has dried completely, its surface now smooth and pale, the color fixed. The damp band you are currently working on is separated from it by several dry strips, so the parchment never becomes so wet that it buckles or tears. This is the secret of the wash: patience, the willingness to let each section dry before the next is begun, the understanding that the sea cannot be made in a single flood, but only in repeated, gentle applications. You check the dry area with a light touch of your fingertip, finding it cool and sound, and then you continue, laying the next strip, and the next. The fly's shadow crosses the chart once more, and this time the fly itself lands on the parchment near the coast of Morocco, its tiny legs making no impression on the dry ink. It walks a short, hesitant path and then flies off again, its shadow gone as quickly as it came. You watch without irritation, your brush poised in midair, and then you resume the stroke without any change of pace. The room's stillness absorbs every small event, the fly, the bell, the settling of a beam in the ceiling, and returns them all to silence. When you have covered perhaps half the Atlantic with the first layer of blue, you pause and step back from the table. The chart now shows a striking division. On the left, the known coasts of Europe and Africa are surrounded by a pale, watery azure that transforms the blank parchment into sea. On the right, the western reaches are still the color of dry hide, waiting. The run lines run through both halves without distinction, their careful geometry holding the whole composition together. You nod slightly to yourself, a barely perceptible gesture, and then you reach for the water jug to refill the bowl once more. The fresh water is cold from the cistern, and it shocks your fingers pleasantly as you dip them to clean a small patch of dried blue from your thumb. You dry your hand on the linen rag and check the saucer of wash, which has developed a thin skin again from the warmth of the afternoon. A swirl of the brush handle breaks the skin and remixes the color, and you add one more drop of gum water to loosen it, the gum itself now beginning to evaporate slightly in the dry air. The mixture is still good, still workable, and you dip the brush and continue. The second half of the ocean receives the same treatment as the first, the same long strokes, the same overlapping bands, the same wiping and re-dipping. The brush travels from the Gulf of Guinea outward toward the Cape of São Roque, the journey across the parchment mirroring the journey that the ships have made in the opposite direction months ago. You think of the sailors looking at charts like this one, tracing the same rum lines with a pair of brass dividers, measuring the distance that you are now coloring. The thought passes without weight and is gone, replaced by the next stroke, the next dip, the next soft whisper of the bristles. The afternoon wears on, and the room begins to gather the subtle signs of oncoming evening. The light through the window has turned from gold to a deeper amber, and the shadows on the wall have grown soft at their edges. The drying rack holds the Brazilian chart in a pool of gentle dimness, its colors now fully set and dark. The portolan chart before you is half-colored, the blue sea reaching exactly to the midpoint of the western expanse, a clean line of demarcation between the work done and the work yet to do. Tomorrow you will apply the second wash to the whole ocean, deepening the blue until it reaches the full marine tone that the chart requires. But for now, the pale wash is enough, a foundation that will support everything that comes after. You lay the brush down on the linen rag and roll your shoulders gently, feeling the muscles loosen. The fly has long since found its way out through the shutter gap, and the courtyard outside is empty of birds. The only living thing in view is the lizard that has re-emerged onto the warm stone wall, its body pressed flat against the heat stored there from the day. You watch it for a slow count of 10, its tiny ribs rising and falling with rapid breaths, and then you turn back to the workshop, where the unfinished sea waits in its pale, patient blue. The tallow candle is low again, the wick bending under its own burnt weight, so you pinch it out with the brass snuffer and let the thin trail of smoke rise and vanish. The portolan chart will stay on the table overnight, weighted at its corners, because to roll it now while the wash is still curing would risk smudging the delicate rum lines. You leave it open, its half-finished ocean catching the last of the amber light, a quiet testament to the afternoon's slow labor. The workshop settles into its evening stillness, the maps resting, the brushes drying, the pigments sealed in their pots, and the great silence of the waiting sea, holding everything in its gentle, unhurried embrace. The afternoon has grown late, and the light through the window has begun its slow withdrawal, leaving the corners of the workshop in a soft grey dimness that creeps outward from the walls. You have laid your brush down on the linen rag, and the half-finished portolan chart lies open on the table, with its pale blue sea drying in the amber air. This is the hour not for painting, but for the quiet work that makes painting possible, the care of the tools that will serve again tomorrow and the day after, and all the days that follow in this room where the sea waits and the ships are silent. You begin with the brushes, because the brushes have given you the whole afternoon and they ask for nothing but clean water and a gentle hand. The squirrel square brush still holds a faint load of blue in its bristles, a residue that must be drawn out before it dries and hardens and ruins the fine, soft edge. You lift a clean cup from the shelf, a small earthenware beaker that is used only for this purpose, and fill it with clear water from the jug. Holding the brush by the very end of its handle, you lower the bristles into the water and begin to swirl them slowly, a circular motion that sends tiny threads of blue curling away from the ferrule and dispersing into the cup like smoke. The water clouds first to a pale, milky color, and you lift the brush out and squeeze the bristles gently between your thumb and forefinger through a fold of the linen rag, a small bead of deeper blue liquid running out onto the cloth. Then you dip again, swirl again, squeeze again. 3 times the cycle repeats before the water in the cup remains clear, the bristles releasing no more color. The brush is clean. You lay it flat on a dry section of the linen, its bristles perfectly aligned and its wooden handle still warm from your grip. And then you turn to the sable brush, the round one that traced the green shores earlier in the day. Its tip still carries a faint olive stain that is harder to see against the dark sable hairs, so you hold it up to the light and sight along its length. There, near the ferrule, a tiny crust of dried green has begun to form where the pigment crept up during the many small strokes along the coast. You dip this brush into a fresh cup of water and swirl it as before, and this time you use the tips of your fingernails to gently tease the crust away, working it loose without pulling or bending a single hair. The green fragment drifts free into the water and sinks, and the brush emerges clean, its point sharp and true. It is laid beside the squirrel brush on the linen, and the two of them rest there side by side, their work done for the day. Now you turn your attention to the mixing dishes, the small white ceramic saucers that have held the washes. 3 of them sit at the back of the table in neat row, one still bearing a shallow pool of the olive green, one with a skin of dried pale indigo from the morning, and one with the deeper marine blue from the afternoon. Each must be cleaned, and you have learned over the years that the order matters, starting with the lightest color so that the cleaning water does not carry contamination from one pigment to another. The pale indigo saucer is the first. You carry it to the waste jar and tip it, letting the thin, semi-dried liquid slide slowly down the glazed surface and into the jar with a soft, reluctant glug. Then you take a damp sea sponge from its resting place in a small dish of water near the shelf and begin to white the inside of the saucer with slow, circular passes. The sponge is yellowed with age but still soft, and it lifts the remaining blue from the ceramic, turning its own pores a faint, dirty azure. You rinse the sponge in the water bowl, squeeze it out, and wipe the saucer again until the surface is white and smooth and gives back no trace of color. The saucer is set aside to dry on a folded cloth. The deep blue saucer receives the same treatment, though its residue is thicker, having sat for longer in the warm afternoon air. The dried skin of color peels away from the ceramic edge when you push it with the sponge, coating back on itself like a thin blue leaf, and you collect these fragments on the sponge and rinse them into the waste jar. The saucer is cleaned, dried, and set beside the first. The green saucer is the most stubborn because the verdigris has a slightly gritty texture even when ground fine, and it clings. You scrape it first with a small bone spatula, drawing the flat edge across the bottom of the saucer in a gentle, even pressure that lifts the dried olive crust in flakes that you tip into the scrap jar for reuse another day. Then the sponge finishes the work, wiping away the last clinging traces until the white ceramic re-emerges, clean and smooth and ready for a fresh mixture whenever it is next needed. The 3 saucers stand in their drying row, and you feel the small satisfaction of order restored. The brass mortar that ground the verdigris this morning still sits near the back of the table, its interior dusted with a fine green bloom. You pick it up and tip it upside down over the scrap jar, tapping the bottom lightly with your knuckle so that the loose powder falls out in a small green cloud that settles into the jar. The pestle is wiped with the dry cloth, its smooth head given an extra polish where your palm wore it bright. You notice a small chip in the rim of the mortar, a flaw that has been growing for weeks, and you open the drawer beneath the table where a small lump of pine resin wrapped in a scrap of linen waits among the other oddments. You pinch off a tiny bead of the resin, Warm it between your fingers until it softens and press it into the chip, smoothing it flat with the edge of the spatula. The repair is small and will hold, and tomorrow the mortar will be sound again. For whatever pigment needs grinding, you set the mortar back on the shelf in its usual place, the pestle standing upright inside it. The quill knives and brass dividers that belong to the chart maker are not your tools, but they rest in a leather case on a small shelf near the door, and they have accumulated a fine film of dust from the parchment that is always shedding its microscopic grain into the air. You take the corner of a soft, dry cloth and wipe the case gently, then lift each tool in turn, the knife with its small curved blade, the dividers with their two sharp points protected by a cork guard, and you wipe them with a single pass of the cloth before returning them exactly as they were. The chartmaker will not notice this, because the chartmaker never comes while you are here, but the tools are clean, and that is enough. The water jug is light now, its contents nearly all poured into bowls and cups and saucers over the course of the day. You lift it by its single clay handle and carry it through the doorway into the courtyard, stepping out into air that has cooled by a few degrees since the afternoon's peak. The flagstones are still warm under your feet, and the bay tree stands in its pot with its leaves now grey-green in the fading light. The cistern is a stone basin against the far wall, fed by a pipe that comes down from the roof and carries the rainwater of previous days into its dark, cool depth. A wooden lid covers most of it, and you slide the lid aside just enough to lower the jug on its rope tether, hearing the hollow knock of the clay against the stone lip, then the deeper splash as the jug fills. You haul it up hand over hand, the rope wet and cool, and the jug comes up streaming, its outside beaded with cold drops that run down and darken the clay. The walk back across the courtyard is 30 steps, each one slow and deliberate because the jug is full and heavy and you have no wish to spill a single drop. Inside the workshop, the jug is returned to its place at the back of the table, and you pour a small amount into the bowl to refresh the water there before sitting for a moment on the high stool with its worn cushion. The stool gives a faint creak under you, a sound you have heard so many times that it has become part of the room's quiet language. From this vantage you look over the workshop and see it in its evening order, the brushes lying in their neat alignment on the linen, the saucers drying in their row, the pigment pots sealed and returned to the shelf, the mortar standing with its repaired rim, the tools wiped and cased, the open portolan chart anchored and still, its pale blue sea fading into the dimness like a real ocean at dusk. The only light now is the tallow candle on the windowsill, its flame the sole warm point in a room that has cooled to the touch. Everything is ready for the morning, and the morning will come whether you are restless or calm, whether the ships send word or keep their silence, whether the world outside remembers this room or forgets it entirely. You slide off the stool and go to the basin in the corner, a small stone sink with a drain that runs out into the courtyard. Beside it is a pot of crushed soapwort leaves mixed with a little olive oil, a soft green paste that smells clean and faintly herbal like a garden after rain. You scoop a small amount onto your palm and work it into your hands, rubbing the fingers together where the pigments have left their daily stains. A blue shadow at the side of your thumb, a greenish line under your nails, a faint ochre smudge on your palm from some earlier work. The soapwort lathers poorly, but cleans well, and you rinse your hands in a trickle of water from the jug, watching the coloured suds run away into the drain and disappear. Your hands emerge pale and clean, the skin slightly dry from the day's work, and you rub a single drop of olive oil into them from the small bottle that sits beside the soapwort pot, working it over the knuckles and the fingertips, until the skin softens and the faint shine of oil replaces the chalky residue of the pigments. The candle on the windowsill has burned down to a short stub, its wick bending low under a cap of glowing ash. You lift the brass snuffer from its hook on the shelf and lower the small bell over the flame, holding it there for a count of 2 until the wick is extinguished without smoke. The room falls into a deep grey dimness, lit only by the last of the dusk that seeps through the window shutter's cracks in soft, horizontal lines. You draw the shutter closed, its wooden panels coming together with a low, solid thud that you feel through the floorboards, and you drop the iron latch into its slot with a gentle clink. The workshop is now sealed for the night. You stand for a moment with your hands still resting on the latch, looking back at the table where the portolan chart lies open under its pale, ghostly sea. The drying rack holds the Brazilian chart in its silent vigil, and the shelf holds its jars and its mortar, and the air holds the faint remaining scents of indigo and gum and soapwort, all mingled and fading. The room will keep its stillness through the dark hours, and when you return in the morning, the water in the bowl will be cool, the brushes will be dry, the pigment pots will be waiting in their unchanging order. The maps will still be unfinished, and the sea will still be silent, and the ships of Magellan will still be somewhere beyond the painted edge of the world, their fate unknown and undemanding. You lift your hand from the latch and turn toward the door, leaving the workshop to its patient rest, and the last thing you hear as you pass through the doorway is the faint settling creak of the ceiling beam, a sound so familiar and so soft that it is already gone before you notice it. The morning arrives with a thin grey light that finds its way through the shutter, cracks in soft vertical lines, and when you push the shutter open, the courtyard beyond is pale and still, the bay tree holding its leaves motionless as if painted there. A coolness lingers in the stone of the walls and the floor, the last breath of the night retreating slowly, and you cross the workshop to the table where the porcelain chart still lies open under its half-finished sea. The blue has dried to a matte, even film, and the rum lines run through it like dark threads through a pale cloth. That chart will wait for its second wash later, but this morning belongs to a different task entirely. You turn to the shelf and let your hand travel past the thick rolls of the coast charts until it finds a lighter cylinder, smaller in diameter and tied with a faded green tape. The label reads Moluccas Speculativum, and the parchment inside is thinner than the others, almost translucent in places, the kind of sheet that was made from a younger skin and scraped to a finer finish. You unroll it carefully, your fingers gentle because the material is more delicate than the heavy porcelain stock, and you anchor it with only 2 weights at the top corners, letting the rest lie free. What spreads before you is not a coast drawn from pilots' reports and sounding leads, but a guess, a hope, a theory, penciled onto parchment by a cosmographer who has never seen the islands he drew. The shapes are tentative, their outlines lighter than the confident ink of the African shore, and the sea around them is empty of rum lines because no one yet knows which winds will carry a ship there. This is a chart of the Spice Islands as they were imagined before confirmation, before Magellan or anyone else had crossed the great ocean and returned with news. The cosmographer worked from old Ptolemaic coordinates and Portuguese rumours, sketches brought back by earlier expeditions that reached as far as Malacca, but no further, descriptions whispered in trading posts and copied into letters. The islands float on the parchment like leaves on a still pond, Gilolo and Serum and the small cluster labelled Insulae Moluccae, their shapes blobby and uncertain, their sizes probably wrong, their positions placed by dead reckoning across a sea that no European had yet traversed. You look at them for a long moment, these imagined islands, and the quiet of the workshop seems to gather around them like the quiet of the ocean they represent. The colour you will use today is not blue, because this chart will not show the sea. The cosmographer wants the islands themselves tinted, a soft golden brown that will distinguish them from the surrounding parchment and give them a gentle presence, a warmth that says land, without saying what kind of land. You reach for the yellow ochre pot, lifting its lid to reveal the fine, dusty powder inside, the colour of sun-baked earth and old straw. Beside it, wrapped separately in a twist of paper, is a tiny parcel of crushed saffron that has travelled all the way from the terraced fields of La Mancha, each fragile red thread dried and powdered and sealed away from the air. Saffron is costly, and you use it only in tiny pinches, but for this map of the unknown islands the cosmographer has requested a wash that carries a hint of gold, something that will glow faintly under a candle flame, and make the islands seem precious. You put a small mound of yellow ochre into the mixing saucer, enough to fill the space of a thumbnail, and then you untwist the saffron paper and tip the very smallest amount onto the ochre, a dusting so fine it is barely visible. The 2 powders are folded together with the tip of the bone spatula until the ochre takes on the faintest orange warm blush, a colour that reminds you of late summer grass on the hills above the river. The gum water is added drop by slow drop, and you stir the mixture into a thin, creamy wash that flows easily across the testing scrap, drying to a pale straw gold that is exactly what you wanted. Not a strong colour, but a gentle tint, the shade of a distant shore seen through haze. The brush you select is the round sable, its point still sharp from yesterday's cleaning, and you dip it into the golden wash with a steady hand. The first island you approach is the largest on the sheet, an elongated shape labeled Gilolo in tiny cursive, its outline wandering in gentle scallops that the cosmographer drew to suggest unknown bays. You place the brush tip just inside the inked boundary and begin to fill the interior with slow circular strokes that spiral inward from the coast, each rotation of the brush laying down a transparent film of gold. The wash pools slightly in the hollows of the parchment grain, creating tiny variations in tone that look, without any effort, like the natural mottling of hills and valleys. You do not draw these features. The wash creates them on its own, a quiet accident of pigment and paper. The brush completes its spiral at the center of Gilolo, and you lift it to redip before moving to the next shape. Serum is smaller, more sinuous, its coastline twisting like a ribbon, and you follow its curves with a slightly tighter spiral. The brush describing a path that narrows and narrows until the whole island is tinted. The golden color is still wet, glistening in the diffused morning light, and while it lies damp, you decide to add a second thin wash to the interior hills, touching the brush to the areas that might be higher ground and letting the new color bleed softly into the first, creating a gentle deepening that the eye reads as terrain without being told what it is. The tiny cluster of islands labeled simply Maluke is next. 5 small dots of ink that you color one by one with the very tip of the brush. Each dot receives a single circular stroke that fills it completely, the gold settling into the parchment and turning the black ink outlines into soft, defined shapes. The islands are so small that you hold your breath for the few seconds each one requires, the stillness of your body matching the tininess of the task. When all 5 are done, you lean back and blink, and the little golden archipelago blinks back at you from the parchment, quiet and patient, holding its place in the speculative sea. The morning moves on without your notice, the light through the window slowly brightening from grey to a clean, colourless white that means the sun has risen above the roofline. The tallow candle on the windowsill is still burning from when you lit it at first light, but now the daylight has overtaken it, and its flame is a pale, almost invisible ghost against the brighter world outside. You pinch it out with your fingers, the wick still warm, and let the thin trail of smoke rise into the air while you return your gaze to the chart. The islands are drying now, their gold dimming as the water leaves the parchment, and you can see that the saffron has done its small work. There is a warmth in the tint that pure ochre would not have given, a hint of something precious, fitting for islands that are said to overflow with nutmeg and cloves. The cosmographer who drew this map will not see the real Moluccas for years, if ever. He works from a room in the Casa de Contratacion, surrounded by globes and astrolabes, and reports from captains who never went beyond Sumatra. His islands are shapes of faith, drawn because they must exist somewhere, because the spice trade requires them, because the old geographers placed a great island of gold and gems in the eastern sea, and the modern geographers have only moved it, never erased it. You color his faith with a wash of gold, and the quiet action feels like a small collaboration across the months of silence. A colorist and a cosmographer, each doing their small part, while the real islands wait somewhere beyond the drawn edge, still unseen, still unknown, still silent. A second saucer of wash is needed after the first runs low, and you mix it with the same proportions, the same folding of ochre and saffron, the same drops of gum water. The consistency is slightly thicker this time, so you add a few drops of clear water from the bowl and stir again, watching the liquid thin and lighten until it matches the first batch. You test it on the scrap, and when it dries to an identical shade, you nod slightly and continue, turning your attention to the scattered islets that the cosmographer has sprinkled across the sea around the main islands. Some of these are so small, they are only a single dot of ink, and the brush touches each one for less than a second, leaving a gold speck that dries almost immediately. Others are larger, irregular ovals with tiny inked bays, and these you wash with the same spiral motion, circling inward until the whole shape is filled. The room around you has grown slightly warmer, the heat of the day beginning to seep through the stone, and you feel it on the back of your neck as you lean over the chart. The Everestillation tricks. Not a breath of wind passing through the window, and the only movement in the room is your hand describing its careful circles and the slow rise and fall of your chest. Outside, the courtyard holds its own stillness. The lizard is on its wall, the bay tree is in its pot, the ants are somewhere out of sight. The world has contracted to the size of the parchment, and the parchment has contracted to the size of each island, and each island is a world that you fill with gold. When the last of the tiny islets has received its wash, you set the brush down and flex your fingers, feeling the small familiar ache that comes from holding the narrow handle for long stretches. The chart before you is now a constellation of golden shapes floating on a pale parchment sea, each one glistening slightly where the most recent wash still lies wet. The effect is quiet but striking. The islands seem to hover, to glow, to hold a light that the paper alone could not give. The cosmographer's tentative lines are now supported by your color, and together the ink and the wash have made something that looks less like a guess and more like a promise. You clean the sable brush in the usual way, a cup of water and a gentle swirl, a squeeze through the linen, and the gold tint runs out of the bristles in faint, cloudy threads. The saucer is scraped with the bone spatula, the dried ochre crust collected in the scrap jar, and the saucer is wiped with the damp sponge until it is white again. The saffron paper is re-twisted and returned to its dark corner of the shelf, protected from the light that would fade it. The ochre pot is lidded and placed back in its row, and the speculative chart of the Moluccas is left on the table to finish drying, its golden islands facing upward like a field of tiny suns. You step back and look at the workshop as it now stands, halfway through the morning, the Brazilian chart and the Portolan chart in their turns on the drying rack, the green shoreline of the practice sheet curled slightly at one corner, and now this delicate golden map of islands that may or may not exist. Each one holds a different color, a different stage of completion, and together they are like a garden of quiet labors, each plot tended in its season. The sea is still silent beyond the window, beyond the river, beyond the strait, and the news of Magellan is still somewhere far away. But in the workshop there is only the next brush to clean, the next saucer to scrape, the next morning that will come and bring its own small task. You pour fresh water into the bowl and sit on the stool for a moment, letting the stillness settle around you like a cloak, and the golden islands gleam softly on the table, waiting for the world to catch up with their existence. The light that enters the workshop has changed its quality for the last time today, shifting from the clean silver of afternoon into a deep amber that spreads across the floorboards and climbs the legs of the table without ever reaching the ceiling. You can no longer trust your eyes to judge the color on a wet wash, because the warm glow of the failing sun makes every blue seem deeper and every green seem darker, and a correction made now would be a correction undone in the morning. This is the hour when the work stops, not because you are tired, but because the daylight has withdrawn its permission, and the only tasks that remain are those of putting away, of closing down, of leaving the room in a state of patient readiness for the day that will follow. You begin with the chart that lies open on the table, the speculative map of the Moluccas with its golden islands, now fully dry and fixed. You lift it by two corners, your fingers pinching the parchment with the lightest possible pressure, so that no oil from your skin transfers to the pigment. The sheet is thin, and it bends slightly in the middle as you raise it, a soft curve that you support with your forearm while you carry it across to the drying rack. The rack is a simple pine frame standing against the wall, its shelves tilted at a gentle angle so that the charts can lie flat without slipping. You slide the Moluccas chart onto the top shelf, where it will spend the night with its painted side facing upward, the golden islands catching a last faint gleam from the window before you move on. Beside it rests the Brazilian chart, its two layers of blue now dark and stable, and beneath that on the lower shelf lies the Portolan chart of the Atlantic, its half-finished sea pale and patient. The practice sheet of the green shoreline is already there, curled slightly at one corner from the warmth of the day. All of them are where they should be, and you look at them for a moment as a gardener might look at a row of planted beds, each one at its own stage of growth. From the drying rack you turn to the shallow pine drawer that sits in the table's underside, a wide flat compartment lined with a sheet of clean linen that has been washed so many times it has become soft as felt. You pull the drawer open with both hands, and the wooden runners slide with a low, smooth sound that has no catch in it. Inside, a series of thin wooden strips divide the space into neat compartments, each one wide enough to hold a single rolled chart or a few loose sheets. These strips are plain cedar, chosen because the wood gives off a faint, pleasant scent that keeps insects away from the parchment. and they are worn at the edges where your hands have lifted them in and out over the years. You remove 2 of the strips and set them aside, then lift the half-finished charts from the drying rack one by one and lay them into the drawer, each sheet separated from the next by a strip of wood, so that no weight presses down on the fresh pigment. The Brazilian chart goes in first, then the Portolan, then the practice sheet, and finally the Moluccas chart is taken from the top shelf and placed gently on the highest layer, its gold side facing down this time to protect it from the faint dust that might settle overnight. You cover the final chart with a loose sheet of blank parchment, a protective shroud that will keep the surface clean, and then you slide the drawer closed with the same smooth, quiet motion. The table now stands empty except for the mixing dishes, the water bowl, the brush cup, and the small waste jar that has been slowly filling throughout the day with the rinsings of brushes and the scrapings of saucers. You pick up the saucers one by one and tilt them over the waste jar, letting the remaining wash slide down the glazed ceramic in slow, reluctant streams. The pale indigo from the morning has already developed a thin skin on its surface, and the skin clings to the saucer for a moment before breaking and slipping into the jar with a soft plop. The olive green wash is thicker and flows more slowly, leaving a faint stain on the ceramic that will need the sponge. The deep marine blue from the afternoon has dried almost completely, and you scrape it with the bone spatula first, tapping the dry flakes into the waste jar before wiping the saucer clean with the damp sea sponge, the same yellowed sponge that sits in its own little dish of water near the shelf. The sponge moves in slow, circular passes over each saucer, lifting every trace of color until the white ceramic shines through. You rinse the sponge in the water bowl, squeeze it out until no more colored water drips from it, and then set it back in its dish. The saucers are dried with a corner of the linen rag and stacked in a neat column at the back of the table, 3 white discs ready for whatever mixture the morning will require. The water bowl itself is now clouded with the faint tints of all the colors that have passed through it during the day. A pale grey-blue-green that you pour carefully into the waste jar, tilting the bowl slowly so that the liquid runs in a thin, steady stream without splashing. A fine sediment has settled at the bottom of the bowl, a silt of indigo and verdigris particles, and you wipe this out with a clean piece of rag, pressing into the curve of the bowl until the ceramic is smooth and dry. Fresh water from the earthenware jug is poured in to fill the bowl halfway, the surface immediately settling into a clear, still disc that will greet you in the morning when you first arrive. The waste jar is now nearly full. Its contents a murky, dark liquid that you will carry out to the courtyard and pour into the gravel drain at the edge of the flagstones, where the pigments will sink into the earth and eventually wash away with the rain. You set the jar by the door so that you will remember to empty it on your way out. Now you turn your attention to the pigment pots, those small unglazed clay vessels that hold the powdered colors. Each pot must be checked, its contents leveled with a gentle tap, its lid pressed down firmly so that no moisture from the night air can creep in and cake the powder into an unusable lump. The indigo pot is still plentiful, the dark blue heap sitting high inside, and you cover it with a scrap of oiled cloth before fitting the lid on top, the cloth acting as an extra seal. The azurite pot receives the same cloth, and the yellow ochre and the verdigris, each one capped and sealed in its turn. The saffron paper is already twisted tight and tucked into its dark nook on the shelf, safe from the light. The brass mortar stands with its pestle upright, the repaired chip now cured hard since the afternoon, and you lift it to check that the pine resin has set properly, pressing it with your thumbnail and finding it firm and smooth. It is returned to its place, and the whole row of materials stands in the same order they have occupied for as long as you can remember. A quiet lineup of pots and jars and tools that ask for nothing but darkness and stillness. The brushes, too, must be put away with care. You lift them from the linen rag where they have been drying, the squirrel square and the sable round, and you sight along their bristles once more to be certain that no trace of color remains hidden near the ferrule. The bristles are soft now, fully dry, and they fan out slightly from the cleaning, so you gently shape them back into their proper forms by drawing each brush through your fingertips with a light, twisting motion. The squirrel brush recovers its flat, even tip, and the sable brush comes to a fine, sharp point. They are laid in the clay jar on the shelf, bristles upward, where they will stay until you take them down again in the morning. The jar is deep enough to protect them from dust, and you note with a small absent thought that it will need to be rinsed out soon, though not tonight. Your hands now carry the stains of the day, faint blue crescents under the nails, a smear of green along the side of your forefinger, a dusting of ochre in the lines of your palm. You step to the corner where the small stone basin sits with its drain running out into the courtyard, and you lift the pot of crushed soapboard paste from its shelf. The paste is cool and slightly gritty, smelling clean and green like a meadow after a light rain, and you scoop a small amount onto your palm. You work it into your hands with slow, deliberate motions, rubbing the fingers together, massaging the knuckles, paying attention to the places where the pigments have gathered. The soapwort does not foam much, only a little thin lather that turns the color of the stains as it lifts them away, a pale blue-green froth that slides down the drain in thin, watery threads. You rinse your hands in a trickle of water from the jug, cupping the cold liquid and splashing it over your wrists, and then you dry them on a fresh square of linen that hangs from a peg beside the basin. The faint herbal scent lingers on your skin, a clean and simple smell that will fade slowly as the evening passes. A single drop of olive oil from the small bottle beside the soapwort pot is rubbed into your fingertips, worked over the dry patches where the parchment and the pigments have drawn the natural moisture out. The oil sinks in quickly, leaving your hands soft and supple, and you replace the cork in the bottle before turning to the candle on the windowsill. It has burned down to a short stub, the wick a blackened curl, and a small pool of cooled wax has spread across the stone sill around its base. You lift the brass snuffer from its hook on the side of the shelf, a simple tool shaped like a small bell with a long handle, and you hold it over the flame for a moment before lowering it gently until the bell covers the wick completely. The flame dies in a silent instant, and a thin, acrid trail of smoke rises from the snuffer's vent hole and dissipates into the dim air. The room is now lit only by the last of the twilight filtering through the window, a soft grey-blue that drains the color from everything, turning the white walls silver and the dark wood black. You set the snuffer back on its hook and lift the spent candle stub from the sill, dropping it into a clay pot of saved wax ends that will be remelted one day into new candles. The sill is wiped with a dry cloth to remove the wax smear, and the fresh candle that will be lit tomorrow morning stands ready in its place. Now the window must be closed. You step to it and place your hands on the wooden shutter, its surface cool and slightly rough under your palms, the grain of the wood raised by years of sun and damp. You draw the two panels inward, and they move with a low, solid sound that you feel through the frame, a vibration that travels up your arms and fades quickly. The meeting edges come together with a soft thud, a note so deep and quiet that it seems to swallow the other sounds of the room. And you drop the iron latch into its slot with a gentle clink that rings once and then stops. The window is now sealed, and the last of the twilight is reduced to a few thin horizontal lines visible through the gaps in the shutter, lines that will fade to nothing within the hour. The workshop is closed for the night, a small stone room holding its breath in the center of Seville, while the evening settles across the rooftops and the river and the distant, invisible sea. You stand for a long moment in the center of the room, letting your eyes travel over everything you have touched and moved and cared for. The table is bare and clean, its slanted surface pale in the dimness. The shelf holds its clay pots in their unchanging row, each lid tight, each vessel still. The pine drawer beneath the table contains 4 charts in various stages of completion, each one separated by a thin cedar strip and covered by a blank parchment sheet. The drying rack stands empty against the wall, its shelves bare now, waiting for the morning. The brushes rest upright in their jar, the saucers are stacked, the mortar and pestle stand ready, the water bowl holds its clear, silent pool, and the waste jar waits by the door to be emptied. Everything is in its place, and the place itself is whole and calm. The last trace of twilight touches the drying rack with a faint, ghostly light, picking out the grain of the pine and the slight wear on the top shelf where countless charts have rested over the years. You watch this light as it fades, thinning from grey to charcoal to a darkness so complete that the corners of the room vanish into it. The hush that follows is not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, a soft pressure that fills the space between the floor and the ceiling, between the walls, between the objects that stand in their patient arrangement. It is the same hush that you hear when you are working, the same stillness that the maps carry in their very substance. but now it is deeper, uninterrupted by the whisper of a brush or the trickle of water, a silence that belongs entirely to the night. Within that silence, the waiting maps hold their own quiet. The Brazilian sea, now locked in the drawer, continues its slow process of curing the indigo binding molecule by molecule to the gum hardening into a transparent matrix that will protect the color for decades. The green shores of the practice sheet lie still, the verdigris releasing the last of its moisture into the air inside the drawer. The portolan chart of the Atlantic carries its half-finished blue, the line between the colored and uncolored sea as sharp as it was when you set the brush down hours ago, a reminder that the work is not done, that it will never be truly done, that they will never be truly done, that there will always be another wash to apply, another coastline to tint, another island to gild, and the speculative Moluccas, those golden imagined shapes, lie face down under their protective parchment, holding the faint warmth of the saffron in their fibers, islands that exist only on this sheet and in the cosmographer's hopeful mind, waiting for a confirmation that may or may not ever come. Beyond the workshop walls, beyond the courtyard and the street and the city, the sea itself continues to hold its silence. Somewhere far to the west, across the ocean you've been coloring for days, somewhere past the Strait and the Great Southern Cape and the immense empty Pacific, the ships of Magellan's expedition are either sailing or anchored or sunk, their fate a question mark written in water. The men on those ships, if they still live, are eating their hard biscuit and measuring the stars and watching the horizon for a landfall that may or may not appear. Their silence is the same silence that fills this room, a quiet that asks for nothing, expects nothing, and receives nothing in return. It has lasted for months, and it may last for months more, and the workshop has absorbed it into its very stones, so that the smell of gum water and the sight of the drying rack and the sound of the closing shutter all carry the same unspoken message. The sea is large, the ships are small, and time in this room moves at the pace of a brushstroke. You lift the waste jar from its place by the door and walk out into the courtyard, where the air is cool and fresh, and the sky above the roofline is a deep velvet blue pricked with the first pale stars. The bay tree stands in its pot as a dark silhouette, and the flagstones are cool under your shoes, the heat of the day entirely gone. You pour the wastewater into the gravel drain at the corner of the courtyard, tilting the jar slowly and watching the dark liquid disappear into the stones with a faint gurgling sound that lasts only a moment. The jar is rinsed with a splash of water from the cistern, swirled and emptied again, and then you carry it back inside and set it upside down on a folded rag to dry. One final look around the workshop confirms that everything is as it should be. The shutter is closed, the candle is out, the brushes are clean, the charts are sleeping in their drawer. You take your smock from the peg near the door and fold it loosely over your arm, and then you step through the doorway into the passage that leads to the street. Behind you, the room settles into its darkness and its hush, the drying rack standing empty, the pot sealed, the water bowl holding its clear disk of stillness. The maps wait in their pine drawer, their colors curing in the dark, their coastlines and seas and golden islands all suspended in the long, slow night. The silence of the sea presses in from the west, invisible and immense, and the workshop receives it without a sound, a small stone chamber at the edge of a world that is still being drawn. The water in the jug is cooler this morning. You feel it through the clay as soon as you lift the vessel from its place on the stone floor, a chill that has seeped into the earthenware during the night, and now presses against your palms. The workshop is cold too, the stones holding the dark hours in their mass, and your breath makes the faintest ghost of itself in the air before the room swallows it. You cross to the window and push the shutter open, letting the first grey light spill across the table, and the courtyard beyond is pearl-coloured and still, the bay tree glazed with a thin dew that will burn off within the hour. The pine drawer beneath the table is pulled open with the familiar smooth slide of its runners, and you lift out the Brazilian chart from its cedar-stripped compartment, peeling back the blank parchment that covered it overnight. The sea you painted 2 days ago looks up at you, its 2 layers of blue, now thoroughly dry and cured, the indigo and azurite locked into the gum and the gum locked into the fibers. The color is a calm mid-blue that has lost the pale transparency of the first wash and the damp gloss of the second, becoming something stable and permanent. You carry the chart to the table and unroll it fully, anchoring the corners with the leather weights, and it lies flat and obedient as if it had never been curled. Today you will give this ocean its third layer, the wash that deepens a sea from a suggestion into a statement. But when you reach for the indigo pot and lift its lid, your thumb meets a shallow heap of powder, a remnant so thin that the clay bottom shows through in pale patches. The pot is nearly empty. You tap the rim gently, and the remaining indigo shifts and settles into a thin, flat disc, enough perhaps for one more small mixture, but not for the broad, generous wash that the Atlantic demands. So you set the pot aside and turn to the storage chest that lives beneath the shelf, a low wooden box of dark chestnut with iron hinges that creak in a voice you know by heart. The lid rises heavily, and inside the chest the supplies are arranged in tidy compartments. There is a stack of spare parchment sheets, a bundle of clean linen rags tied with twine, a clay jar of gum Arabic crystals waiting to be dissolved, and in the far corner a row of small wrapped parcels, each labelled in sepia ink. Your fingers walk along the row until they find the one that reads Indigo, New, and you lift it out. The parcel is wrapped in coarse brown paper and tied with hemp string, and you carry it to the table and untie the knot with patient fingers, spreading the paper open to reveal a dark, dense cake of compressed indigo, its surface faintly glossy where the pressure of the press has polished it. It is the size and shape of a small river stone, and it smells of earth and something faintly sharp, a smell that has travelled with it from the indigo vats of Gujarat through the hands of merchants and dock workers and ship captains until it arrived here in this stone room where it will become the ocean. Breaking a new cake of indigo requires a particular touch. You take a small hammer from the drawer beneath the table, its iron head wrapped in a thick layer of linen cloth to prevent it from shattering the pigment too violently. The cake is placed on a folded scrap of leather, and you tap it once, lightly, testing its hardness. It does not break, so you tap again with a little more force, and this time a crack runs across the surface, fine as a hair, followed by another, and then a small chip falls away onto the leather. You continue tapping with the same controlled, gentle rhythm, turning the cake between taps, and it yields piece by piece, splitting into fragments that scatter across the leather like dark blue shards of slate. When the pieces are small enough, a few of them are selected and placed in the brass mortar, and you begin to grind them with the slow circular pressure that transforms every pigment from its raw form into the fine, silky powder that will flow from the brush. The grinding takes longer than you remember from the last cake. This indigo is dense, its particles clinging together stubbornly, and you work the pestle in steady circles, pausing now and then to scrape the powder back toward the center with the bone spatula. The sound is a low, gritty murmur that fills the morning air, and your wrist grows warm with the effort. Gradually, the fragments break down into a coarse grit, then into a finer sand, and finally into a powder so light and soft that when you lift the pestle, a small blue cloud rises from the mortar and settles slowly back. You tip the powder onto a sheet of clean scrap parchment and examine it in the grey morning light. It is even, smooth, without any glinting crystals or dark lumps, ready for the wash. A portion of it is scooped into the now empty indigo pot. The pot is lidded and returned to the shelf, and the rest is set beside the mixing saucer for immediate use. The gum water bottle is still half full from yesterday, and you pull the cork and tip 3 slow drops into the saucer, where a neat pyramid of the fresh indigo waits. The drops bead on top of the powder for a moment, dark and glossy, and then you stir them in with the brush handle, grinding the paste against the ceramic until it smooths out. A few more drops of water from the bowl thin the mixture, and you add a touch of azurite from the other pot to keep the tone cool. The proportions arriving by feel rather than measurement, a knowledge that lives in your hands rather than your mind. The test stroke on the scrap dries to the exact shade of the existing sea, a mid-blue that is neither too pale nor too deep, a color that will deepen the ocean by 1 more degree without overwhelming the fine black ink of the coast. You pick up the squirrel brush from its jar and dip it into the fresh wash, wiping the tip on the saucer rim, and then you lean over the chart of Brazil. The 2 existing layers of blue have dried to a smooth, uniform field, and the coast sits sharp against them, its black ink undimmed. The 3rd wash will be applied in the opposite direction from the 2nd, to avoid creating any visible stripe or grain in the finished sea, so you begin at the southern edge of the chart this time, near the latitude line that marks the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, and you draw the brush northward in a long, even stroke that travels up the full height of the ocean. The fresh blue flows out behind the bristles, darker than the dried layers beneath it while it is wet, and it settles into the parchment with a soft, brief glisten. Stroke by stroke you work your way westward across the Atlantic, each band overlapping the last by that same invisible margin, each dip of the brush yielding the same measured load of color. The motion is so familiar now that your body does it without instruction, your shoulder rocking gently, your wrist kept loose, your breathing falling into the slow, steady rhythm that matches the pace of the brush. The morning light strengthens as the sun climbs above the roofline, and the grey of the early hour gives way to a clean, pale gold that makes the wet wash gleam like the skin of a calm sea at dawn. The tallow candle on the windowsill is still unlit because the day needs no supplement, and its wick stands white and cold in its own small pool of hardened wax. After every dozen strokes, you pause to let the damp area settle, and during these pauses you attend to the small details that keep the work clean. The rim of the saucer accumulates a thin crust of drying indigo, and you wipe it away with the corner of the linen rag. The brush bristles begin to gather a slight stiffness at the ferrule where the pigment creeps upward, so you rinse the brush briefly in the water bowl, squeeze it through the rag, and re-dip. The chart itself requires a watchful eye, because the third wash adds a substantial amount of moisture to the parchment, and in one corner the sheet begins to lift and curl as it did on the first day. You reach for the clean wooden ruler and lay it across the curling edge, and the parchment subsides with a tiny crackle, then lies flat once more. The ocean deepens as you work. Where the third wash passes over the dried second layer, the blue becomes noticeably richer, losing its last trace of paleness and taking on the character of true open water, the color that a pilot would recognize as the deep Atlantic far from shore. The contrast with the still unpainted western portion of the chart is now dramatic, a great field of deep blue meeting a field of raw parchment along the curving line of the mid-Atlantic, and you feel the quiet pull of the unfinished work, the knowledge that tomorrow or the next day you will complete this sea and bring it all to the same steady saturation. The fly that visited yesterday has not returned, and the courtyard beyond the window remains empty of its sparrow. The only sound besides the whisper of the brush is the distant, muffled tolling of a bell from some church further off than Santa Maria, a low note that arrives and fades without disturbing the stillness. The room has warmed now, the sun having travelled far enough to send a bright oblong across the floorboards, and the chill of the morning is entirely gone. You feel the warmth on the back of your hands as they move across the chart, and you think briefly of the sailors who may or may not be feeling the sun on their own hands, somewhere in the Southern Ocean, their skin burned dark by the glare off the water, their eyes straining for a sight of land. The thought flickers and passes, and your brush continues its northward journey. By the time the sun has reached the midpoint of the window and the light falls straight and bright across the table, you have covered perhaps half the chart with a third layer. The wet area nearest your hand is still glistening, but the earlier strokes have dried to a matte finish that exactly matches the tone of the second layer beneath them, and the sea now possesses a depth that was not there an hour ago. It is the cumulative effect of the washes, each thin film adding its own small weight of pigment, each layer locking into the last until the parchment carries a blue that seems to glow from within. You step back to look at the whole composition, and the coast of Brazil now appears to float on a sea that is dark and substantial, a real ocean rendered in nothing but water, gum, and powdered stone. The unused portion of the fresh indigo powder still sits on its scrap of parchment near the saucer, and you fold the paper carefully into a small packet and tuck it into the indigo pot for future use. The remainder of the wash in the saucer is still workable, but the morning is advancing and your shoulder has begun to ache with the particular deep warmth that means you have done enough for now. You decide to stop at this natural midpoint, leaving the western half of the sea for another session, and you lay the brush down across the linen rag. The chart is left open on the table, its new blue drying in the midday light, and you pour a cup of cool water from the jug and drink it slowly while standing at the window, looking out at the courtyard where the bay tree has now lost its dew and stands in full, still leaf. The lizard is back on its warm stone, and the ants are crossing the flagstones in their steady column, and the world outside continues in its quiet way while the workshop holds its peace. The ocean on the table deepening by the hour, the ships in the distant Pacific still somewhere beyond the edge of the known. The morning opens with a sky the color of a dove's breast, a soft, seamless grey that presses gently against the window and fills the courtyard with a steady, shadowless light. You push the shutter open and the air that enters is cool but not sharp, carrying the clean wet earth scent of the cistern and the faint green breath of the bay tree. There is no wind, and the flagstones below are dark, with the memory of a night dew that is now beginning to lift. This is a good morning for fine work, for the kind of brush stroke that requires a hand so steady that even the pulse at the wrist must be quieted, and you know before you even turn to the shelf that today's task will be the celestial chart. It has been waiting in its own small roll, separate from the larger maps, a tube of parchment no wider than your thumb is long, tied with a single white thread. The label reads Colum Australe, written in a careful italic hand that is not the cosmographer's but someone else's, perhaps the chartmaker's assistant. You carry it to the table and sit on the high stool with its worn cushion, which you have pulled closer today because this work will keep you still for many hours, and you do not wish to lean forward from a standing position, a posture that would make the fine brush tremble. The stool accepts your weight with the low, familiar creak of its wooden joints, and you unroll the chart between your palms. The parchment is of the finest quality, scraped to an almost translucent thinness, and it has been cut small, no larger than a man's open hand. What it shows is not land or sea, but the southern night sky, the region around the pole that is invisible from Seville, a part of the heavens that no astronomer here has ever seen with his own eyes. The chartmaker has drawn the star positions as minuscule inked dots, each one perfectly round and no bigger than a grain of fine sand, placed with the aid of a pair of dividers and a steady hand. They cluster in the shapes of constellations that are still new to European knowledge: the Southern Cross, the Centaur, the Ship, a few others whose names are written in tiny spidery letters along their edges. There are no figures drawn, no mythological beasts or gods, only the bare dots and the faint looping lines that connect them into patterns, the way a pilot would need them for navigation. The background is the color of raw parchment, and it is this background that you are here to change. You reach to the shelf and take down the indigo pot, the same one you filled from the broken cake yesterday, and you place it beside a clean saucer. Today's wash must be the palest you have ever mixed, a tint so thin that it will barely stain the parchment, because the chart must remain legible under the dim lantern light of a ship's deck, and because the stars must shine through the blue as if through a veil of high, thin atmosphere. You scoop out the smallest possible heap of indigo with the horn spoon, a mound no bigger than a lentil, and drop it into the saucer. Then you add water from the bowl, not drop by drop, but in a single careful pour that fills the saucer to its rim, diluting the indigo until the mixture is the color of a robin's egg seen through water, a blue so faint that when you lift the spoon, the liquid seems almost clear. You stir it with the spoon's tip for a long time, making sure that no particle remains undissolved, and then you test it on the faithful scrap of parchment. The dried stroke is not blue so much as a coolness, a pallor that makes the parchment next to it seem warm by comparison. It is exactly right. The brush you need is not the squirrel square or the round sable, but something finer, a single hair of a sable's tail set by a specialist in the Cal de las Armas into a hollow quill no thicker than a wheat straw. You keep this brush in its own slim wooden case lined with silk, and you take it out now and hold it up to the light. The hair is a fine dark line that tapers to an invisible point, and it has been months since you last used it, so you test its spring by touching the tip to your thumb and watching it bend and then resume its shape without a kink. Perfect. You set it across a small porcelain rest that you place near the saucer, and you take a moment to settle yourself, feet flat on the floor, elbows resting lightly on the table's edge, the stool adjusted so that your eyes are directly above the chart at a distance that allows your hand to hover. The first star you choose is the brightest one in the constellation of the Ship, a dot near the center of the chart that the pilot will later use to find his latitude. You dip the single hairbrush into the pale wash, drawing up only the tiniest bead of liquid that clings to the tip like a dewdrop, and then you bring the brush to the parchment. Instead of painting the background in broad strokes, you will paint everything except the stars, leaving each dot isolated in a tiny sea of clear parchment. The brush touches down half a finger's width above the bright star and begins to move in a slow descending line, the blue film spreading behind it in a transparent wash that darkens the parchment to a cool, twilight hue. As the brush approaches the star, your pace does not change, but your attention narrows, focusing on the dot of ink with an intensity that makes the rest of the room vanish. A fraction of a hair's breadth before the bristle would touch the ink, you lift the brush, curving its path around the star in a tiny, precise arc that leaves a clear, uncolored margin no wider than the star itself. The brush resumes its downward stroke on the far side, and the wash continues as if nothing had happened, the star now a tiny island of parchment color in a sea of pale blue. You lift the brush and let out a breath you did not realize you had been holding. The first star is done, and it sits in its clear circle with a clean, sharp edge, the blue of the wash stopping exactly at the margin, with no bleeding and no raggedness. You dip the brush again and approach the next star, a fainter one that forms part of the cross, and the process repeats, the slow descent of the wash, the brief suspended moment of the curve, the resumption of the stroke on the far side. Each star takes only a few seconds, but the seconds are dense with attention, and after 10 stars you pause to rest your eyes. The room is very quiet. The grey light from the window has brightened slightly as the clouds thin, and the tallow candle on the sill remains unlit because the daylight is more than sufficient for this delicate work. The constellations are scattered across the chart in no particular order beyond the sky's own design, and you work through them methodically, moving from left to right, from the top of the chart to the bottom. The cross takes shape as you clear its 4 bright stars and then its fainter fifth, and the pale blue sky around it seems to push the constellation forward, making the pattern more visible, more legible. The centaur, a sprawling figure of many stars, demands a longer session, and you find your hand moving in slow, wandering paths as the wash flows around star after star, the brush describing tiny, continuous loops that avoid each dot with the same unwavering precision. It is a form of meditation, this work, a state in which the boundary between yourself and the brush and the chart becomes blurred and thin, and all that exists is the next star, the next curve, the next faint ribbon of blue. The morning passes without bells because the bells of Santa Maria do not ring on certain days, and you do not notice the silence because you are inside a deeper silence of your own. The stool creaks only when you shift your weight, which you do rarely, and the sound of the brush on the parchment is so faint that it is more a felt vibration through the quill than an audible noise. The water in the saucer evaporates slowly in the cool air, and you add a few more drops from the bowl, stirring them in with the tip of the brush handle to keep the wash consistent. The color remains that same pale, ghostly blue, a tint that suggests a sky just after sunset when the first stars appear. There is, on one edge of the chart, a small emblem that the chartmaker has drawn to decorate the corner, a ship under full sail rendered in fine black ink, its hull curved and its mast tall, a little galleon that represents the spirit of navigation. It is no larger than your smallest fingertip, and the ink lines that define it are so thin that they almost disappear when you look at them directly. The emblem must be colored, and for this you will need 2 additional pigments, yellow ochre for the hull and a tiny amount of white lead for the sail, which must stand out against the pale blue sky. You set aside the single hairbrush and take up the round sable, its tip still sharp, and you mix a small dab of ochre with gum water until it becomes a warm honey-colored paste. The hull of the ship receives this ochre in a single careful stroke that follows the inked curve from bow to stern without wandering, and when you lift the brush, the hull glows with the same quiet gold that you used on the Moluccas, a color that speaks of wood and sun. The sail is the more difficult part because it must be white, a true opaque white that will cover the blue wash and remain visible in the low light of a ship's deck. The white lead pigment is kept in a small, heavy pot of its own, its lid sealed with a twist of oiled cloth because lead must be handled with care and never allowed to become airborne dust. You open the pot and scoop out a pinhead-sized amount with the very tip of the bone spatula, placing it in a fresh saucer. White lead is dense and creamy, and it needs more gum than the other pigments to bind it into a paint that will not crack. You add 2 drops of gum water and stir the mixture into a stiff, smooth paste that holds its shape when you lift the spatula. Then you thin it with a single drop of water, just enough to make it flow, and you pick up the finest of your round brushes, a sable so small it holds almost no liquid. The sail is a small rectangle of ink, and you fill it with the white lead, using tiny tapping strokes that deposit the pigment in thin layers without flooding the outline. The white is startlingly bright against the parchment, brighter than anything else on the chart, and it will remain so even after the blue wash covers the surrounding sky, because you will paint the sky around the sail just as you painted it around the stars, leaving the white untouched. You hold the brush almost vertically and dab the white onto the sail, smoothing it with the point until the surface is even and opaque, and then you set it aside to dry. The hull ochre has already dried to a matte gold, and a little ship now sits in the corner of the chart like a jewel, its sail white and its hull glowing, a miniature vessel ready to sail the southern sky. The rest of the morning and the early part of the afternoon are given over to the remaining stars. You relight the candle, not for its light, but for its warmth, because the room has remained cool under the grey sky, and the small flame on the windowsill sends a faint, steady heat towards your hands that keeps them from stiffening. The stars of the Southern Cross are already done, and the centaur and the ship, but there are other, smaller clusters marked on the chart: the triangle, the bird, the chameleon, and a scattering of unnamed dots that serve as reference points for the pilot's calculations. Each one must be circled with the same care, the same slow, deliberate arc of the single hair brush. You find a rhythm that is slower than any rhythm you have used before, a pace that matches the tiny scale of the work, and your breathing becomes so shallow and regular that a feather placed on your chest would not stir. The candle flame burns straight and tall without flickering, as if it too is holding its breath. By the time the grey sky outside begins to pale further into the flat white of full afternoon, the chart is nearly complete. The entire sky background from the top edge to the bottom carries the same uniform, almost invisible veil of pale indigo, a color that changes the parchment from a warm, raw material into a cool, nocturnal expanse. The stars stand out as crisp, clear dots, each one perfectly margined, and the connecting lines of the constellations remain sharp and black, undimmed by the wash. The little ship in the corner sits with its white sail gleaming, a bright point of contrast against the twilight blue, and the whole chart has taken on the quiet, serious beauty of a thing made with patience. You set the single hairbrush down and flex your fingers, which are cramped from the long hours of gripping the narrow quill. The chart is left open on the table to dry, its pale surface catching the grey light and holding it, and you stand up slowly, feeling the stiffness in your back and the lightness in your head that comes from intense concentration. Outside the window, the courtyard is still and overcast, the bay tree holding its leaves in perfect stillness, the lizard absent from its stone. The world has not changed while you worked. The ships are still silent, the sea is still wide, and the news of Magellan is still somewhere between the stars and the water, unarrived and undemanding. You pour a cup of water from the jug and drink it slowly, looking at the celestial chart with a quiet, private satisfaction that will never be spoken aloud. A feeling that belongs only to this room and this morning and this small perfect map of a sky no one in Seville has ever seen. The season has turned without announcement, and a subtle warmth now lives in the stones of the workshop, even in the early hours, a stored heat from the longer days that releases itself slowly through the night, so that the room is never quite as cold as it was in winter. You notice it in the way the water from the jug feels less shocking against your skin, in the way the tallow candle softens slightly at its base, where it sits in the warming sill, in the way the parchment accepts the wash with a slightly quicker absorption, because its fibers are not tightened by the chill. Nothing else has changed. The shelf holds its pots in their immutable row. The pine drawer slides on its runners with the same low sound. The brushes rest in their jar with their bristles clean and sharp, and the sea on the porcelain chart, now finished with its second full layer, has dried to a deep, steady marine blue that will not need another wash. That chart has been rolled and tied with its linen tape and returned to the shelf, its work complete for now, and a new chart has taken its place on the slanted table. This new chart is a rendering of the Amazon Delta, the great river that pours into the western Atlantic in a sprawl of channels and islands, so complex that the chart maker's inklines twist across the parchment like the veins of a leaf. The sheet is large, but not as large as the portolan, and it has been drawn with the most recent information available, which is to say, with fragments and guesses, the reports of a few coastal expeditions that saw the mouth of the river from a distance and sounded a few of the outermost channels without venturing into the interior. The coast here is a low, wet land, not the sharp, rocky capes of Brazil, but a soft, indefinite boundary where the water and the earth seem to mingle without a clear division. And the chart maker has expressed this by using a lighter ink and a more tentative line, leaving gaps where the true course of the channels is unknown. Your task is to color this delta with a thin olive-green wash along the many winding banks, a color that will suggest not forest but marsh, not the deep woods of the coast, but the pale, waterlogged grasslands that fringe the great river. You mix the green with care this morning, using the last of the verdigris from the pot and a fresh pinch of yellow ochre to warm it, stirring the powders together before adding the gum water drop by drop. The mixture is thinner than the green you used for the Brazilian coast, more water and less pigment, because the delta is a place of transition and the color should be hesitant, a mere tint that allows the parchment to show through as the pale, silty water of the river. You test it on the scrap, and the dried mark is a soft, muted olive, the color of reed beds under an overcast sky, and you nod to yourself and dip the round sable brush. The channels of the delta are many and narrow, and each one must be traced along both its banks with a steady, slow hand. You begin at the seaward edge of the chart, where the river mouth opens into the Atlantic, and you follow the first channel inland, the brush describing a thin, undulating line of pale green that hugs the ink on one side and then, after a redip, on the other. The banks are not straight. They curve and branch and sometimes loop back on themselves, forming islands of parchment that must be left uncolored because no one knows what lies on them. Your brush navigates these loops with a patience that has become second nature, lifting and redipping, tracing and lifting, the tip describing the same tiny arcs that you have made 1,000 times before. The green spreads slowly across the parchment, a network of faint veins that gradually define the shape of the delta without ever filling it in completely. The morning advances, and the sun outside has now cleared the roofline and sends a bright, warm light through the window that falls directly on the table, illuminating every grain of the parchment and every hair of the brush. You adjust the angle of the slanted table slightly, lifting its back edge and inserting the wooden peg into a higher hole so that the light does not bounce into your eyes, a small adjustment that you make without thinking. The courtyard is alive with the sounds of early spring. A bee has found the small purple flowers that grow in the cracks of the far wall, and its low hum comes and goes through the window, a sound that blends into the stillness without disturbing it. The sparrow has returned to the rim of the bay tree's pot, and it sits there preening its wing feathers with quick, neat movements of its beak while you work. The tallow candle on the sill has not been lit today. The morning needs no supplement, and its wick remains white and cold in its pool of wax. You work steadily, channel by channel, island by island, the pale green wash accumulating in a delicate pattern that is more like a drawing than a painting, a network of colored lines that map the unmappable edge between land and sea. The Amazon itself is left the color of the parchment, a broad, empty waterway that flows from the left margin of the chart to the sea, its emptiness a statement in itself, an acknowledgement that the river's interior course is unknown and will remain unknown until someone travels it from end to end. The green banks frame this emptiness, giving it shape and definition, and the result is a chart that is more question than answer, a quiet speculation in green and parchment. Hours pass, measured only by the movement of the sunbeam across the floorboards, from the leg of the stool to the base of the shelf to the far wall where it now illuminates a patch of white plaster that has flaked slightly over the years, exposing the rougher stone beneath. Your hand continues its work, the brush dipping and tracing, and your mind rests in the quiet space that opens when a task is so familiar that it requires no thought, only presence. The bee has moved on, the sparrow has flown, and the courtyard has fallen into its midday hush. That pause in the day when even the ants slow their march and the lizard retreats to its crack in the stone. Inside the workshop, the only movement is the brush traveling along the banks of the delta. The only sound, the soft whisper of sable on parchment, a sound so faint that it is more a memory of a sound than a sound itself. You think, in the way that one thinks of distant things while the hands are busy, of the expedition that is still out there somewhere, beyond the ocean you have colored so many times. The silence from Magellan's fleet has lasted so long now that it has passed beyond worry, beyond expectation, into a realm of quiet acceptance that feels permanent, like the silence of the stars in the celestial chart or the silence of the golden islands in the speculative map. If news comes, it will come, and the maps will be changed to reflect whatever the news reveals, new coastlines drawn, new islands added, the blank spaces filled in with ink and wash. If news does not come, the maps will remain as they are, half finished and half speculative, and the workshop will continue its eternal routine. The water poured, the pigments mixed, the brushes dipped and cleaned and dipped again. Either outcome is the same to the parchment and the saucer and the gum water bottle, to the brush that does not know or care what it paints, to the colorist who has become, over the years, a part of the room's stillness, a living component of the workshop's quiet machinery. The delta chart receives its last strokes of green late in the afternoon, when the sun has begun to slant toward the rooftops and the light has turned from gold to amber once again. You trace the final channel, a small branching waterway near the southern edge of the chart, and then you set the brush down on the linen rag and look at what you have made. The Amazon Delta now lies on the parchment in a web of pale olive lines, each bank defined, each island suggested, the great river itself a blank, shining path through the center of the composition. It is a quiet piece of work, understated and patient, and it will serve its purpose whether the river is ever explored or not. You lift the chart by its corners and lay it on the drying rack, where it joins the celestial chart that has been curing there since yesterday, its pale indigo sky now thoroughly dry, and its white ship still gleaming in the corner. The routine of cleaning begins, as it always does, as it always has, as it always will. The brushes are swirled in water, squeezed through linen, reshaped, and returned to their jar. The saucers are scraped, wiped, dried, stacked. The water bowl is emptied, cleaned, refilled from the jug. The pigment pots are checked and sealed. The mortar is inspected. The quill knives are dusted. The waste jar is carried to the courtyard and emptied into the gravel drain, where the green and blue and gold residues of the day's work sink into the earth and disappear. The soap water paste is rubbed into your hands, the lather lifting the faint stains from your skin, and the olive oil is smoothed over your knuckles, and the scent of clean herbs drifts through the room and fades. The candle, unlit today, remains on the sill, ready for a darker morning. You draw the shutter closed and drop the latch, and the soft thud of the wooden panels meeting is the same sound it has always been, a low final note that seals the workshop into its night. The drying rack holds the delta chart, and the celestial chart, two quiet companions in the dimness, and the pine drawer holds the Brazilian chart, and the portolan and the practice sheet, and the speculative Moluccas, each one at its own stage of completion, each one waiting for the next layer, or the next correction, or the next piece of news that may or may not come. The shelf holds its pots, the table holds its bowl, the floor holds its familiar creak, and the room holds its stillness like a cup holds water. No courier has knocked at the door, no ship has been sighted off San Lucar with news of the expedition. Magellan's fate, and the fate of his 5 ships and his 200 and some men, remains unknown to the Casa de Contratacion, to the merchants, to the pilots, and to the colorist who paints the seas they may or may not be sailing. The silence from the Pacific is as complete as it was on the first morning you entered this room, and it will still be complete tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, until one day a dusty rider comes from the coast with a letter in a leather pouch and the whole city stirs into excitement. But that day is not today, and today the only event is the slow drying of the green wash on the delta chart, the slight curl of the parchment edge as the moisture leaves it, the settling of a single dust mote onto the surface of the water bowl. You stand at the doorway and look back into the room, your smock folded over your arm. The last of the afternoon sun has found a gap in the shutter and thrown a single thin line of golden light across the floor. a line that falls on the leg of the stool and on the corner of the drying rack and on the edge of the shelf where the indigo pot sits with its lid tight and its cloth seal in place. The dust in the beam floats in a slow, silent dance, each particle rising and falling in the still air, and you watch them for a long, calm moment. These tiny travelers that have come from the parchment and the pigments and the wool of your smock and the stone of the walls, all of them drifting together in the last light of the day. The work will continue tomorrow. Another chart will be unrolled, another wash will be mixed, another coastline will receive its thin line of color, and the sea will deepen by one more layer, and the brushes will be cleaned, and the shutter will be closed, and the silence will return. Steady as the tide that never quite reaches the shore, you step through the doorway and pull the door gently closed behind you, and the workshop remains in its patient dark, its maps unfinished, and its oceans waiting. A small stone room at the edge of a world that is still being colored, one wash at a time.